Thank you everyone for joining. Today's topic is pricing strategy for professional services. We are all revisiting the same pricing questions. Are my prices too low or too high? Is it too soon to raise my fees? How do I justify my rates? And why do I have to? So in today's session, the goals will be to demystify pricing strategies, explore some tactical parameters, and get clear on the value that your organization offers. So we're going to get started with, I'm going to invite Randall to share a few thoughts to get us thinking, and then we'll flip into Q&A. But first, a little about Randall Craig. He has founded several successful startups. He's held a long-time position at a Big Four consulting firm. He was a senior executive at an American public company, author of 8 books, in the Speaker Hall of Fame, master facilitator. He's helped over 100 organizations scale, and he works with me at the Brain Trust Professional Institute, helping organizations grow their businesses. Randall, pricing strategy for professional services is its own art, which you have lots of experience with. Help us eliminate the noise. What can you tell us about pricing strategy to help leaders focus on the factors that matter in the calculation?
Yeah, and it's a really interesting questions. And what I would say is this. There's 2 parts to every transaction. There's the buyer, there's the seller. And both have a part to play in actually having the problem solved. Because at the very end of the day, certainly in professional services or any kind of service-oriented business, people don't care about you. They care about how you can solve their problem. They'll eventually care about you and vice versa. And hopefully that's something that will grow as the relationship grows. But you know, the idea of as the buyer of services, have you got the ask framed properly? Have you actually done your homework? And as a seller of services, it's a question of, well, at what price should you do it? So I'd like to take a step back and share a particular framework that I absolutely love. It's called the Price Expertise Trust Framework, and essentially says that you as an organization compete on these 3 dimensions. Price, and if you really compete just on price, is always the cheapest. Okay, so there'll always be somebody who's cheaper than you who'll be able to, you know, undercut you and presumably get the work. Expertise, which is really the question of how smart are you and how applied you are with the knowledge you actually have. Can you actually solve the problem, if you will? And trust, which is, do they trust what you say? What comes out of your mouth, is it in their interests, or is it in your own private interests, etc.? I want to sell more and more and more is not really what I call a trust-based relationship, as opposed to making sure that when you answer their questions, you're answering it from their perspective. So price, expertise, trust, you know, which would you rather be? Would you rather be a cheaper, smarter, or more trusted? Do you compete on value, on becoming a thought leader, or being a trusted advisor? The answer is all 3. And today we're really more focusing on the price aspect, but I don't want to give up the idea of expertise and thought leadership on one side, and the whole issue of being a trusted advisor, both of those things which we handle at the Brain Trust Professional Institute. So today's really more about price and how we figure that one out, and the whole dynamic between buyer and seller.
Okay, Randall, I'm going to share with the group here a story that you've told me before. You tell a story where once upon a time with a prospect long ago, you told them your rate and their reaction was, that's it? Like, that's so reasonable. Okay, and you share that you said to yourself in horror, I will never quote that low again. So tell me, what is the reaction that we want from people when we share our rates with them?
So in that particular case, it was I truly was embarrassed, okay, because clearly the value that I was delivering for that particular client was out of sync with the particular price that I quoted, which I thought was a very reasonable price. But as far as this client was concerned, it was an incredible value, and I mismatched that, you know, and of course I honored the price because that's what I quoted. But pricing also sends a signal. If, for example, you're promising a very significant amount of change and you price it so low, a client may say, how is it that you're able to actually deliver at that kind of low level? And on the other hand, if you price it so ridiculously high, you're also setting expectations there, excuse me, that are hopefully you can actually deliver on. So in that particular case, all the conversations with that particular client, I set certain expectations, you know, with respect to impact, which thankfully I delivered. But on the other hand, I didn't do something that I should have known better, and you know, it's not never again will I charge that particular price. It's really more, you know, I've got to spend a little bit more time understanding really what the value was in the eye of the beholder.
Okay. So we are selling the value that we bring and the change that we can bring. And that's correct. Ultimately, clients are paying for a result. They have a goal in mind, and how they achieve this goal is being outsourced to you, to us, the service provider. So how long it takes isn't really the most important factor in pricing. The biggest factor is in the value you offer. But how do we quantify the value you offer? Like you said, you were mismatched. Like, how do you quantify that? So for instance, in a discovery process questionnaire, questions could include things like how much money and headache is this problem causing you? Or how much will you save as a result of this? Right? So clients may not readily, or prospects may not readily share this information with you, and they may not themselves know how to answer it. But like, is there like a formula you can share? Like, how do you
Tell
quantify?
you the truth, you did a good job of actually sharing what the actual formula is. Have that conversation, right? And so really what Rania said was you can't learn about the client unless you're listening and you're asking. And so those problem sizing, opportunity sizing, problem sizing, risk identification sizing kinds of questions are critically important. And it's also a good cue, not just with respect to, okay, so you're going to price here versus here or down here, but it gives you a bit of a cue with respect to the deep importance that an organization actually has, you know, for solving that kind of problem. And to be very practical about it, what if you ask those questions, and it's not like, okay, I've got my 7 questions that I need to ask you in a discovery meeting kind of thing, but it's a conversation and everything. What if at the end of the day it's $100,000 problem? It's $100,000 problem, and the price that you're thinking about is $100,000. What's the probability of that client saying, I'm gonna press the button, I'm gonna, you know, show me the contract, I'll sign it? The answer is absolutely zero, right? If it truly is $100,000 problem, they're not going to pay $100,000 to solve it. You know, there's risk that maybe you don't solve it, right? So you know, some organizations say, well, we'll do a 10 to 1 kind of thing. You know, if it's $100,000 problem, you know, probably I could, you know, charge, you know, they'd be willing to pay 10,000, maybe 20,000. Okay, but likely 10,000, right? So on the other hand, if it's $1 million problem, okay, and you just charge 10,000, that's a problem too, because maybe there's not enough effort that you'll need to spend, okay, to solve that $10,000 that $1 million problem with just $10,000 worth of work effort, right? So understanding what that is gives you one of the 3 key parameters that you actually need to determine what is the price you're actually gonna charge. So, for example, you know, if we look at a client's budget for a particular aspect, a particular problem, gee, we've got this problem, we've got a budget, it's a $10,000 budget, right? And to solve that $100,000, you know, problem with that $10,000 budget, it might work out quite nicely. If on the other hand, if their budget is only $1,000 for that, you know, you probably will not be able to do the job properly, in which case it's way too low. So, you know, if we think about it, you know, the 3 things, you know, that you need to keep in mind in pricing is, first of all, the cost of the actual service. So whether you use an hourly rate, an internal hourly rate, and say, okay, well, the cost of that service to provide that job, if you will, this is different than the price. It's the salaries and benefits. It's all of the overheads, the fully loaded costs. It's the support and other services. It's a call it a little bit of a profit margin on top of that, because you have to pay for your own internal costs, you know, whether it be professional development or whether it be computers or any of the other capitalized kinds of things you might have. So that cost of service is almost a bit of a floor. You can't take a job where you're going to be losing money. Number 2 is, what's the competitive offering? What are the other, you know, alternatives that the client actually has? You know, if it's a bidding situation, that's fine. Okay. It's a bidding situation, and everyone's going to bid, and that price presumably is one of the factors. But you know, another competitive offering is, gee, we're going to do it internally, or we're not going to do it at all. Because very much organizations say, well, gee, maybe we can do it internally. Maybe it's worth it to give it a try or get it halfway done internally. So if you've got a good sense as to what the competitive offerings are, whether it's internal, whether it's external, and somebody else, you get a sense of, and then finally the budget area, right? And the question about whether the budget should be moved or can be moved speaks to those earlier questions that Rania asked about discovery, of seeing what's the size of the problem, right? Because if it's $1 million problem and they've got a $1,000 budget to solve it, you can have a conversation about what the disconnect might be. And if there's a disconnect, it's better to be resolved before you actually get on the job as opposed to afterwards. So that's kind of where I would see it, kind of wiring together a little bit. Good
Okay.
question.
We built it one way. I want to flip it and move back this way. Okay, so pushing forward further on this, scoping the size of the problem. We have friends on the call here, marketers, others, they're providing a service, they have their expertise. If they're resolving a problem for an industry that's larger and has much more profitability versus one that's less, and you have within each industry, you have companies that are more or less profitable, like if you are marketing for an airline is different than selling dollar store products, so your effort as the expert and as in your service firm is the same. What if you have 3 clients who are all brothers running 3 different companies, and they say you've priced the dollar store client and the airplane client differently for the same services? Are they allowed to push back and go, well, it's the same service?
Hmm. So I guess the answer to that is yeah, of course they can. How is it that my buddy over there is this, and the answer to that, it's happened to me before, is you know what? The basis of how we come up with the pricing is the same, but it's not really actually the same job. For example, your organization has got this history, theirs has got that history. You're faced with these kinds of strategic challenges. While we can't talk about the other organization's strategic challenge, they're different. Your management team size, who we have to interact with, is this size. Theirs is a different size. Where your organization's strategy is from the board. It's so even though things might sound the same, we're going to help you with a fill in the blank strategy. We're going to do management training. We're going to do such and such. Very often that there's substantive differences. Sometimes the differences um, not apparent at the very beginning, and that sort of boils it down to a conversation. A good example, Ronnie and I, about a month and a half ago, we delivered a retreat to a global insurance company, and we're doing so again next week with a growing North American ad agency. Okay, both of them are retreats. Okay, but the types of preparation and the work that's required in each of them was different, and what they're looking to get out of it was different. The organizations were different. The people were different. The size was different. Like so many things were different, but it was still called, let's do a retreat for this management team, right? So it'd be weird, I think, that if we said, okay, it's the same price for both of them, right? So um, I see Andrew Jenkins mentioned some clients cost more to work with than others. Some are low maintenance and highly collaborative, while others get in their own way. Yep, that's part of it. And I think that part of the discovery and conversation that you actually have with a client beforehand gives you a sense as to how much care and feeding they need. So, for example, we've worked with some companies where the leadership needs to be up to speed on every single thing, and there's a lot more interaction required. Now, the good thing about that interaction is it develops buy-in from the client, and it sort of makes sure we're more tightly aligned, for example, for delivering something for a client. On the other hand, it's just a lot more time, a lot more effort. Sometimes there's a lot more complexity. When there's partnerships, for example, and multiple partners need to be involved. Well, thank you. Oftentimes there isn't a managing partner. It's just a small group of equal partners. Sometimes when there's a managing partner and there's a bunch of other partners, and then there's people underneath and a staff. The complexity of the client, notwithstanding some are easier and some are not easy to work with, the complexity of the client means that more effort will have to be spent.
As your company grows, Randall, in professional services especially, expenses grow. So talk to me about how you would suggest a strategy of how projected costs should influence current pricing. Like how far in advance should you adjust pricing to account for future anticipated costs?
That's a good one. You know, it depends on the business model of the organization involved. So, for example, if you're signing typically contracts that are, say, 3 years or so in the a 3-year term, you've got to make sure that you've got built into the contract either built-in price increases along the way, or you've actually got built-in you pre-built in, if you will, a higher level than north. Why? Because you know that your cost of delivering the service will increase. So that's part of it. But you know, the cost of the service is only one part of it compared to the competitive offering and the budget as well from the client. So it has an impact, no doubt about it. I remember years ago when for the very first time, it was like a duh kind of moment where I realized, gee, for multi-year contracts, you can put in automatic price increases every year. Okay, separate from scope changes. Well, it seemed pretty obvious after the fact, but I didn't have them in those contracts way back when. So I think that you can plan, you could build in, if you build in too much, you might not win it because you might be, on the you might not be the winner on the price sweepstakes when you're competing with other people. On the other hand, if you don't do that, you run the risk of not running a good business. So
I love this question from Geraldine. That was a question I had also where, it's not just about the pricing strategy. The goal is to get paid. So what can we do to reduce friction there? So Geraldine asked, what percentage do you have them pay up front versus after delivery?
it really depends on the basis of how your business model is set up. So for example, it's very good to actually have them pay some money up front. Why? Because it sort of confirms the contract. It gets the accounts payable department it gets you into the system. It gets everything aligned. So when invoices come later on, there isn't a whole bunch of fuss and bother. So that's one part of it. If your model is one where there's multi-stages to the actual delivery, then most clients will require that you have milestone-based payment deadlines, right? They'll probably want a certain holdback at the very, very end, excuse me, at the very, very end, just to make sure you deliver everything. So that's reasonable too. If you're doing something that is a huge amount of planning, some work, and then a delivery, and then that's it. A 50% upfront and 50% upon delivery is reasonable. If it's over a very long period of time, you don't want to wait to the very end to get 50%, right? And because it's over a long time, the client may balk at the idea of paying 50% right at the very beginning, which is where milestone payments come in. But other than that, for shorter engagements, 50/50 is very, very reasonable and it's not unexpected. So thank you, Caroline.
Lynn's added here. We have in the past showed how the fee is built for transparency and credibility, number of days anticipated per stage and so on. This is partly a brand thing, being accountable. Plus, this also allows us to go back to the client as needed if things start trending much more in time, although we typically eat most of that overage. We know about that, Lynn. Is this an old school method? Good question.
Yeah, yes. Lynn, it is an old school method. Okay, so let me just first of all say, the whole purpose of transparency and everything is important. So here, for example, is the exact methodology we use. Here's the steps that we typically do in each methodology. Here's the number of interviews or survey, whatever, that we're expected to. This is all about transparency. But the question of how many hours do we have actually, attached to each one of these things? Most people who've got some deeper experience selling services know that some might be higher, some might be lower because it is an estimate, but hopefully in terms of the entire engagement, it kind of balances out to where it is. Now, let's just say, for example, in there, you're very clear about the scope. You're going to be doing 10 interviews. And all of a sudden the client says, well, you know what? We've got this other division. We want you to do 20 interviews. Okay, in which case, thank you very much. Change request, and you should pay for it. Okay, or change request, note that it's different, but any little bit of extra little, space we had, okay, is not, it won't be available anymore, right? So being transparent is critically important. I think being accountable is important, for some people in services where you're just selling hours, okay, that's all you're doing, you're selling hours. Okay, my suggestion is, are you really selling hours? Are you selling the solution to a problem? Okay. And if you're selling the solution to the problem, what do hours have to do with it? Sometimes you have to put a lot more if you're selling that solution. Okay. Sometimes you get a chance to do a little bit less, but as you get experience, you probably have a good sense of approximately how much time it's going to take. Right. So if you're not selling hours, what are you doing? You're selling compared to the value of what you're able to do, right? The impact of what you're able to do, I should say. So what I would say there is that if you're selling hours and it's a $6,000 engagement and it's that $100,000 problem, is $6,000 really the right number for you to be putting in that proposal? Well, once again, cost of service is one thing, competitive offering is another, budget's that third criteria, right? And I'd probably suggest that you might be able to charge a little bit more. And by the way, think about what that does. If it turns out that you go above your $6,000 of internally budgeted time, it means you don't feel like you're being taken advantage of because you've got a couple $1,000s more of headspace that you could do something with, right? And I think that what that does in terms of your attitude on the job is absolutely critically, because the client will feel that as you're doing the work. Okay. I think one of the biggest challenges for people who are selling hours is when you get to near the end of the hours, all of a sudden, the work effort slows down to a dribble and the client gets ticked off. And you might have done amazing work for 95% of it, but all of a sudden, most experienced, advisors will nip it in the bud far, far earlier, but that doesn't mean that others on the job won't sort of say, hey, listen, are we working for free here? What's the story? Right. The other thing I would say is when it comes to your actual pricing, thinking about the cost of service aspect of it, you could say it's going to cost so many hours of time to actually deliver this. Excuse me. And then you can start to say, well, this particular client, getting into Andrew's point, this particular client, I know there's going to be a higher risk of delivery because there's going to be a lot more back and forth with this client compared to quote our standard client. So if you want, at the very end, you could say, okay, so it's a $6,000 thing. Normally I'll put a 15% kind of like fudge factor in. So maybe it's now 7,000, etc. But gee, this one client, it's a new client, it's a new industry. My indications are they're going to be very needy. Maybe I've got to put a 35 or 40% sort of fudge factor in. So that 7,000 now becomes 9 or 10,000. So I think that you can start to do that. And likewise, for the clients that you've done a lot of work with before, where the risk level is far lower, why would adding 15%, why would you do that? Okay, there isn't that risk. Okay. And it speaks to being, or there's far less risk anyway. And so why don't you, be a little bit more competitive, right? And give them a better rate, right? Once again, I don't think it's always about rates. I think it's about doing that discovery and making sure that you truly understand what the problem is that you're being hired to solve and what the impact of the problem is. If it's important to everybody at the client, hopefully they will have done their homework and they'll understand what the value is. Otherwise, why bother going to solve it? And by the way, sometimes when government-oriented organizations say, well, we've got so much money in our budget, we got to use it up by October 31st or December 31st, that's a different sort of angle here. We're not talking about that in this particular case, but in traditional procurement, that's where it is.
Thanks, Randall. That's really helpful. So the takeaway for me, and I just want to underline it, is that identifying sort of the deliverables and the milestones and what you're going to do, that's the important part to be transparent about. The hours is really your business in terms of how you juggle that. And there's going to be changes and there's going to be, and all of that, but that does not need to be visible to the client.
Correct. But I will say I'm not being judgmental on people's business model as one where they're selling hours. And for those particular clients, I know that might not be the case with you, but for any of our listeners, okay, if that's your business model and if that's the expectation, for example, this is something that I'm not saying you should stop doing. If this is the client expectation, this is the way you work. Okay, I just think that thinking a bit beyond that might also be helpful. So
Yeah, I like the term, like some of the, and I haven't done really yet, this transition from instead of like your fee will be, but your investment will be, because we are solving problems, we are doing things. And can you comment on just kind of some languaging that you found that is helpful in having the clients appreciate that, I mean, we throw ourselves into stuff and, it is an investment for us too. So just any kind of
sure.
word choices.
Yeah. So what I would say here is that we're not talking generalities here. At this particular place, there's you as a very specific service provider working with a very specific client, right? We're not talking about B2C here. We're talking about B2B, if you will. And as a result of that, you'll decide whether any kind of language makes most sense. So that's one thing. The second thing is there's a lot of people in the world of professional sales who will use the term, your investment is such and such. I would just caution that sometimes when we use some of that technology, it sort of moves us into that kind of zone of being, oh, this is just another like a salesy kind of thing, right? So you could use it, but just be sensitive that some people may look at it as a bit funny. I always thought it was kind of weird. Okay, it says this is how much I'm going to pay. Is whether you call it an investment or something else, it doesn't matter. This is how much we got a budget for, or how big a check I got to write, right? So sometimes what you can do is you can say to solve the such and such problem, my professional fees are such and such, or our professional fees are such and such. Okay, and that includes blah 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 blah, right? If terms like investment is whatever, I hate using the word cost, right? Because that's the exact opposite, right? I like the concept of investment, but how it's framed, etc. I think you just have to. It's a one-to-one kind of thing, as opposed to this is my template, right? And like any word, actually in a proposal, it's a one-to-one thing.
So David said sometimes government requires an hourly rate, which is a pain. They claim they need that for accountability to the public. So I actually had a whole bunch of questions about hourly rates, including exactly this. Like, would it make good business sense to include hourly pricing as an option for those clients out there that are one-track minded or don't understand like about the pricing that isn't hourly?
So I think the answer is it depends. I know that sounds like a bit of a cop-out, but it does. David's absolutely right. Government procurement is an entirely other world into and of itself, right? Depending on the level of government and the size of the particular contract that they want to put out, you got to be on this list. Vendor of record, there's a whole bunch of similar terms. Gee, everything is, pardon me, scored over a number of different criteria, price being one of them, etc. So if you have, if you've got, for example, a team that's working on a government procurement, and the partner's rate is $800, and the junior analyst rate is $62.50. Okay, what are you supposed to do if they just say what is the rate that will be used? And I think I think the challenge here is that you can give a range. You can say, depending on the role, I've been involved where they said, what are the particular roles, what are the rates, etc. What percentage of the time is going to be spent by each person on it, as a guideline. So government procurement has a lot of those specific things, and it's very simple. If you want to play the game of, you have to know what the rules are and you follow them. If you don't follow the rules, you're out the door. For a corporate or larger not-for-profit, where the procurement is a little bit more, is still sophisticated, but they might not ask that. I think that's a little bit more problematic, because you're effectively locking in a particular rate that may or may not be what you want, and they'll infer. So, for example, one of the things you might say is the standard rate for such and such used to determine pricing in this proposal is X. Okay, for additional hours above such and such, the rate would be X plus, right? So that might be one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is to say, well, listen, at the very end of the day, the cost is such and such, the total cost is such and such, and it's fixed price. Or we've got, call it the average. We've also got a minimalist, and we also have an enhanced version of that as well, where you have a choice between, door A, B, and C, and each of them gives, different things, and there's a different risk profile that's attached to all three of them. And obviously the price is going to be different between all three of them, right? So, you can drive down the hourly cost of anything by getting a junior to do the work, right? And you can increase it, by having more senior people do the work.
I recently heard a clip of Neil Patel, a respected voice, talk about A/B testing on pricing, but he did not at all in the talk about the execution of this.
So the concept of A/B testing, I love, right? Because with a big enough data set, you can determine whether in fact A is better or B is better. Now, the problem is certainly with professional services or large organizations, you don't have the volume to make up A/B testing on pricing in a parallel function. Okay, but what you can do is you can do it in a serial way. So for example, if you've got engagements where you try, for example, different pricing models or different pricing levels, right? And you notice that when you do time and materials pricing, for example, this is the kind of outcome, and this is kind of the client engagement experience, and these are the internal pressures. And gee, if you do fixed pricing, it's different because of this. If you price at this is what happens. Oh, too high, we never get in. This one too low, we're not making enough money. It's just not sustainable for the business. So you can do that in a serial fashion, etc. But very often, and it might not be true for everyone here, very often the services that you provide are specific for a particular client, in which case it's harder to do A/B testing because you don't have enough volume, if you will, to determine that.
I want to follow up with another question about volume pricing. Okay, so one way to secure partnerships and get more hours is certainly to lower your base rate through, reduce pricing for volume. Okay, but for professional service firms, where more volume on clients and work means more people, and more people is more managers, and more people means it's slowing down, it complicates things and significantly increases costs. Like, where's the win?
I love the question, and because maybe there isn't a win, but sometimes we're chasing, the beauty that's the grass is greener on the other side of the fence, right? Let's get lots of juniors, and we've got that methodology, and we're just going to let that go. But the juniors don't have that experience, and gee, more costs for managers, etc. We see that same argument with respect to outsourcing. So many organizations, professional service organizations, will outsource a big chunk of work to overseas, to India, to Vietnam, to other places, and doing all that work there. Okay, the cost of doing it obviously is far reduced, but there's a management component. Okay, we're certainly aware of that, right? There's the cost component, right? There's the cultural differences. There's a whole bunch of things, right? So I think it's a question of how you as an individual business wish to structure yourselves. Is it to say, well, we're going to have 30 juniors, a very high leverage model of like 30 juniors to every senior? Or are you going to say, well, we're going to have very small, where you've got two people of differing but senior enough levels working together, etc. And there may be a difference in level, but on the other hand, it's North American pricing, if you will. There isn't delegation to a junior, right? And so I think that I've lived in both models, right? And there's pros and cons. You can grow the staff count in a big way, but you also grow the complexity, right? On the other hand, when you're doing a lot more commodity-like work, call it an audit or a certain type of legal kind of work, the idea of actually having lots of juniors doing the work, competent people, don't get me wrong, but doing that work, and the senior managers, the partners, etc., are only billed out for those exclusive things that only they can do. That's also a good model, right? But the idea of recognizing that there's two ways of doing it, and then sometimes it doesn't make sense. Brain Trust Professional Institute, we've got two people, me and Rania, who do delivery, and we've got one person that does some coordination and administrative work, right? We don't have a million juniors running around, right? On the other hand, other organizations do. Why not? Let's get a whole bunch of contract trainers in. Let's get a whole bunch of subsidiary, junior coaches in, or something like that. It really depends on what your model is more than anything else.
Lynn here asks, can you comment on price per participant pricing on training/education, for example, as being the basis of fees from the provider? So establishing a minimum level of registrants slash cost to run, and then a per participant after. Any advantages or perils in this? Good question. On that question, we'll break here for part 1 on pricing strategies for professional service firms. We'll pick up with more Q&A in part 2. And if anything we talked about so far resonates with you, do reach out. We'd be happy to have a conversation and share resources. You can email us at info@randallcraig.com or book a call at www.randallcraig.net/30. See you back for part 2.